Thomas Briggs had always been a quiet young man who preferred long rides in the open desert over noisy saloons or crowded ranch houses. He liked the sound of wind moving across the dry land, the soft creak of his saddle, and the distant call of birds circling high above the cliffs. On this day, he was returning from checking the far side of the ranch fences when something strange caught his attention. The ground looked disturbed. He noticed broken branches on the path. The kind that did not break naturally. Leaves were crushed into the sand, and there were marks as if someone had fallen or crawled. Thomas slowed his horse, leaning forward to study the signs more closely. He was not an expert tracker, but he had lived long enough in the desert to know when something was wrong. The warm air felt thick, as if holding a story that had not yet been told. Thomas dismounted and crouched, running his fingers across the dust. He found footprints light but hurried. Some were steady, others were uneven. Then he saw small drops of dried blood, scattered near the rocks. His chest tightened with worry. Whoever had passed through here was injured, and the tracks looked recent. Thomas knew the land held many dangers: sharp rocks, wild animals, sudden storms, and sometimes misunderstandings between different groups of people. But he also carried a simple belief taught by his mother. If someone needed help, you did what you could. He could not turn away. He took a deep breath, mounted his horse again, and followed the trail. The trail led him deeper into the rocky valley. The farther he went, the more signs he found: broken twigs, disturbed sand, and more blood. The sun was high, heating the desert so much that the air shimmered. After nearly an hour of searching, he reached a narrow patch of land, where a fallen tree leaned against a large rock. Something moved behind it. Thomas stopped instantly. His hand went to the side of his horse, calming the animal, and he stepped forward, slowly. At first, he did not see her clearly. Then, as his eyes adjusted to the shade, he saw a young woman lying partly hidden beneath the branches. Her breathing was uneven, her clothes torn, and her arm wrapped around her stomach as if trying to protect herself. Her hair was long and dark, tangled with dust and leaves. Her skin showed she was Apache, a proud people who lived across the mountains and valleys. Thomas felt a jolt of worry. An injured Apache woman in this condition meant she had escaped something dangerous. She opened her eyes slightly, and her gaze met his. Even in pain, her eyes were sharp and full of strength. For a moment, both of them stayed still, neither knowing what the other would do. Thomas raised his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. She tried to move away, but pain made her flinch. Thomas spoke softly, saying he wanted to help. She did not answer, but he could see fear mixed with exhaustion on her face. She tried to sit up, but her legs shook, and she leaned back again. Thomas hesitated only for a second. If he left her here, she would not survive the night. He moved closer but stayed slow and gentle. She watched him carefully, her eyes following every step. Thomas knew that trust could not be forced. He spoke again, using simple words and a calm voice, explaining that he had found her tracks, that she was injured, and that he could take her somewhere safe. She did not respond, but she did not push him away either. When she tried to stand, but collapsed to her knees, Thomas quickly caught her before she hit the ground. Her body was light but tense with pain. She whispered something in her own language, her voice weak. Thomas did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. She was scared. He answered softly that she was safe with him. He lifted her carefully into his arms and carried her to his horse. The moment he set her on the saddle, she grabbed the horn tightly, her face tightening in discomfort. Thomas climbed up behind her, steadying her so she would not fall. As they started moving, Thomas felt the weight of what he was doing. Helping her meant stepping into a situation he knew nothing about. He had no idea who might be searching for her, what danger she had escaped, or how others, settlers or Apache, would react if they saw him with her. But he could not ignore someone suffering alone in the desert. The horse moved slowly at first, careful not to jostle her. Her head leaned slightly against his chest as she struggled to stay awake. Thomas tried to ride as gently as possible. Every few minutes, he checked her breathing. The desert stretched endlessly around them, quiet except for the soft rhythm of hooves. He wondered how long she had been wandering. Her clothes were dusty, her face pale, and her hands bruised. She must have gone through something difficult, something that had left her alone and hurt. After nearly an hour of riding, Thomas decided to head toward an old mining cabin he sometimes used. It was hidden behind rocks and rarely visited by anyone. There, she could rest, and he could gather water from a nearby spring. As they traveled, the sun began to lower, painting long shadows across the sand. The woman stirred weakly, raising her head, looking around. For a second, she seemed confused, unsure of where she was. She looked at Thomas, her eyes filled with questions he could not answer, but she did not resist him. She allowed herself to lean back again, too tired to worry about anything more. By the time they reached the small cabin, the sky had turned a warm orange. Thomas dismounted first, then helped her down. She tried to stand, but staggered. He caught her again, guiding her inside. The cabin was simple, old wooden walls, a small cot, and a dusty table, but it was safe. Thomas set her gently on the cot. She winced as she lay down, her injuries reminding her of every movement. Thomas quickly fetched water and let her drink slowly. She relaxed slightly as the cool water touched her lips. He then checked her wounds carefully, making sure not to frighten her. Most injuries were cuts and bruises, but her side had a deeper wound that needed cleaning. She watched him the whole time, cautious but calmer now. When he finished, she whispered her name, Nalin. It was soft, almost lost in the fading light. Thomas nodded, repeating her name so she knew he understood. He told her his own name. She listened quietly, her eyes slowly closing as exhaustion pulled her into sleep. Thomas covered her with a blanket, making sure she was warm, then sat near the doorway, keeping watch. The desert night could be harsh, and danger could arrive without warning. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, Thomas realized the truth. Saving her was only the beginning. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew he had made the right choice. He had found a stranger, hurt and alone, and he had done what his heart told him to do. And in that quiet moment, he had no idea that this simple act of kindness would change both their lives and perhaps even the history of the land forever. Inside the small mining cabin, the night passed slowly. Thomas barely slept. He stayed near the doorway, listening to the wind brushing against the wooden walls and checking on Nalin every few minutes. Each time he looked at her, she seemed a little more peaceful than before. Her breathing had become steady, and her face, though tired and pale, no longer showed the same sharp pain he had seen in the desert. When the soft light of dawn began to slip through the cracks of the cabin walls, Thomas stood up and stretched his tired arms. He stepped outside quietly so he wouldn't wake her. The early morning was cool, and the air smelled fresh after the long, warm night. Thomas walked to the small spring near the cabin. He filled a bucket with clean water and returned inside. Nalin was still asleep when he entered, though she shifted slightly, as if sensing his presence. He placed the bucket near the table and began preparing a simple breakfast. Dried bread warmed over the fire, a little jerky, and a cup of warm water. He wasn't sure what she usually ate, but he hoped it would help her regain strength. After a few minutes, Nalin's eyes slowly opened. She stared at the ceiling at first, confused, then turned her head toward Thomas. Her expression held both uncertainty and relief. She tried to sit up, but pain stopped her, and she leaned back with a soft breath. Thomas walked to her side and helped support her carefully. He offered her some water, and she drank slowly, her hands trembling lightly. When she finished, He offered her the bread. She hesitated at first, studying his face as if trying to understand his intentions, but then she accepted it. Thomas spoke softly, telling her she was safe here, that no one knew about this cabin, and that she could rest as long as she needed. She nodded slightly, though her eyes darted around the room, taking in the surroundings. It was clear she was still alert, still careful, still unsure if she could fully trust this stranger. But there was also a quiet acceptance. In her eyes, she understood he had saved her life, and she was willing to let him help. After she ate a little, he cleaned her wounds again. She watched him closely, her breathing steady now. He moved carefully, not wanting to hurt her more than necessary. When he finished, she whispered something in her own language. Her voice was soft, and he could not understand the words, but he sensed she was thanking him. She then spoke in broken English, struggling to find the right words, telling him her name again, and that she belonged to an Apache group that moved across the nearby mountains. She explained, with short phrases and gestures, that there had been a sudden clash with another group near the river. In the confusion, she had become separated and injured. She had walked for hours, maybe even days, trying to find her way back. But her strength had run out. Thomas listened patiently. He didn't interrupt her, even when he didn't fully understand everything she said. He allowed her to speak at her own pace. He felt a deep respect for her struggle and for the courage it took to survive alone in the harsh desert. When she finished, she lowered her eyes, as if ashamed for needing help. Thomas shook his head gently, telling her she had nothing to be ashamed of. Anyone would need help after something like that, he said. I'm just glad I found you in time. Nalin looked up, studying his face again. She saw honesty there. Simple, steady, and without hidden meaning. She relaxed a little more. Still, she was cautious. The world she came from had taught her to be careful, especially around people she did not know. Thomas understood this and did not push her to open up more than she wanted. Hours passed quietly. Thomas kept the fire going, checked the surroundings outside the cabin, and gathered more water. Nalin rested, though she often tried to sit up and help, only to be stopped by pain. Thomas encouraged her to stay still and heal. When she apologized again in her soft voice, he just smiled and said she would have plenty of time to move around once she regained strength. By midday, the temperature outside had risen. Thomas opened the small window to let fresh air flow in. Nalin watched him with curiosity. She seemed to be learning who he was through his small actions, his patience, his care. The way he never raised his voice or made quick movements. She could tell he meant no harm. As the afternoon light filtered into the cabin, Nalin began speaking more. Her English was limited, but she used her hands to help explain her thoughts. She told him about her family, about her group, and about the land she grew up on. She described mountains she loved, valleys she knew by heart, and the way her people traveled with the seasons. Thomas listened with great interest. He had never heard these stories before, and he realized how much he didn't know about the people who lived beyond the ridges. In return, Thomas shared small things about his life. He told her about the ranch he worked on, about the long rides he took to check fences and cattle, about how he had lost his parents young and learned to take care of himself from an early age. He spoke slowly so she could understand, and she listened with quiet focus. She even smiled once, a small but warm smile, when he mentioned how he used to fall off horses as a child. Their conversations were simple, but each small exchange built a tiny bridge of trust between them. It wasn't sudden or dramatic, it grew slowly, like the steady rise of the morning sun. Later in the afternoon, Thomas heard a distant sound outside the cabin. He stepped out to listen more carefully. In the far distance, he saw dust rising, signs of riders moving across the valley. His heart tightened. He did not know who they were or what they were looking for, but he knew their presence meant trouble. He quickly went back inside and told Nalin about it. Fear flickered in her eyes. She tried to sit up again, but Thomas stopped her gently. He closed the window, dimmed the small fire, and made the cabin look empty from the outside. Then, he waited. The riders passed far away, their figures small against the vast desert. They did not come close, but the sight reminded Thomas that the world outside was dangerous for both of them. As the day moved toward evening, Nalin seemed stronger. She sat up more comfortably, though still with pain. Thomas helped her eat a second small meal. Afterward, she motioned for something. Using gestures, she asked for a stick and a flat piece of wood. Thomas found them, and she began drawing simple shapes: mountains, rivers, paths. She showed him where her people might be traveling, where she last saw them, and the direction they usually took. Thomas studied the drawing carefully. He realized how far she had wandered and how difficult it would have been for her to survive alone. When she finished, she looked at him with a question in her eyes, as if asking whether he would help her reach her people. Thomas nodded slowly. He could not imagine leaving her alone after everything she had gone through. He told her he would take her home once she was strong enough. She exhaled softly, a quiet sigh of relief mixed with gratitude. Night fell again, filling the cabin with shadows. Thomas lit a small lantern. Nalin lay down to rest. But this time, she did not look afraid. She looked tired, but safer than before. Thomas sat near her again, but she motioned for him to sit closer, as if wanting him to keep watch where she could see him. He respected her silent request and stayed near the cot, assuring her through his calm presence that she was not alone. The fire outside the cabin of danger had not disappeared, but inside, something gentle had begun to grow. A fragile trust formed from courage, kindness, and the simple act of two strangers learning to understand each other. And as the desert wind whispered outside, Thomas knew their journey had only just begun, and the days ahead would test them even more. The next morning arrived with a pale golden light slowly stretching across the desert sky. Thomas woke early, as he always did, but his mind felt heavier than usual. The sight of the riders from the previous day still lingered in his thoughts. He moved quietly around the cabin, checking the windows and the door to make sure everything was secure. Nalin was still asleep, her breathing calm but shallow, reminding him how fragile her situation remained. Even though she looked better than when he found her, she was not strong enough to move quickly or defend herself if danger arrived. Thomas stepped outside to gather fresh water. The desert morning was silent, except for the soft wind brushing over the rocks. As he reached the small spring, he knelt down and splashed cool water on his face, trying to clear his mind. But the feeling of being watched stayed with him. He didn't see anyone, but the desert had many eyes: travelers, hunters, scouts. Anyone could be out there, and not everyone would be friendly. When Thomas returned to the cabin, Nalin was awake. She was sitting up slowly, holding her side as she breathed. She watched him enter, and something in her eyes told him she sensed the tension. She lifted her hand and pointed to the outside, asking silently if something was wrong. Thomas hesitated, then told her in simple words about the riders he had seen yesterday. Her face tightened with worry. She knew what it meant. She spoke softly, saying that if people were searching, they might continue to sweep the area. She made a gesture showing men on horses moving in circles, covering ground again and again. Thomas nodded. He knew they couldn't stay in the cabin forever, but moving too soon would be dangerous for Nalin. She needed more time to heal, even if time was the one thing they didn't have. He sat beside her and asked her how much strength she had regained. She closed her eyes for a moment, testing her breathing, her arms, her legs. When she opened them, she shook her head. She could move, but not far. Not fast. Thomas understood. He also knew that hiding her was becoming harder with each passing hour. News spread quickly in the desert. Stories of a lone Apache woman injured and wandering would travel from campfire to campfire, from ranch to ranch. Some people might help, but others would not. And none of them knew Nalan's story the way Thomas now did. He spent the next few hours preparing quietly. He gathered his few supplies, water, dried food, blankets, and a small knife for basic tasks. He checked the horse's reins and tightened the saddle. Nalan watched him, her eyes showing both gratitude and worry. She knew he was making choices that could shape both their futures. Even though she couldn't speak many words, her silence carried meaning. She was asking him if he was sure. Thomas knelt beside her and told her gently that he wouldn't leave her. Not now, not after everything. She lowered her eyes, touched by his promise. She picked up the piece of wood from yesterday and redrew the rough map of her people's direction. Her fingers traced the mountains, the river bend, and the valley she hoped to reach. Thomas studied it again, more carefully this time. The path was long and full of risks, but it was the only chance. By noon, Nalan tried standing with Thomas's help. Her legs shook, and she grabbed the edge of the table for balance. Thomas supported her gently, letting her take her time. Her body moved slowly, but she was determined. She knew they could not stay here much longer. While she rested again, Thomas stepped outside to gather small pieces of wood for the fire. As he walked around the side of the cabin, he suddenly froze. On the ground near the rocks, he saw new hoof prints, fresh ones, pressed deep into the soil. His heart thumped hard. Someone had been close to the cabin during the night or early morning. He knelt down, studying the tracks. There were 3 horses, maybe 4, and they were moving toward the east. Thomas didn't know if they belonged to settlers, travelers, or scouts. But the thought of strangers near the cabin made his chest tighten. He rushed back inside and closed the door carefully. Nalan looked up instantly, sensing the change in his energy. Thomas explained what he had seen, using simple words and gestures to show the hoof prints. Nalan's face grew serious. She sat up straighter, trying to ignore her pain. Her voice was soft, but firm when she spoke. She said they needed to be ready. Soon. Thomas agreed. He spent the next hour helping her practice standing and walking inside the cabin, holding her arm gently, supporting her when she stumbled. Even small steps hurt her, but she pushed herself. Sweat gathered across her forehead, not from heat, but from effort. She was fighting her own body to survive, and Thomas admired her strength more than he could express. Later in the afternoon, he cooked a small meal. While they ate, Nalan told him more about her people. She used simple English mixed with gestures, describing how her group traveled with the seasons, how they cared for their families, and how she had been separated during a sudden conflict. She said she had tried to return but got lost in the harsh desert land. She paused often, searching for words, but her voice carried the weight of truth. Thomas listened with deep attention. Each word she shared opened a window into her world, one he had never understood before. The more she spoke, the more he realized how deeply different their lives were, and yet how much fear and hope they both shared. When evening arrived, Thomas heard distant sounds again, hooves, faint but clear. He quickly moved to the window and looked out. In the far distance, he saw a group of riders moving slowly across the valley. They were too far to identify, but close enough to worry him. He whispered to Nalan to stay quiet. She pulled the blanket closer around herself, her eyes sharp and alert. Thomas put out the small fire so the smoke wouldn't reveal their hiding place. He stood at the door, barely breathing, waiting to see if the riders would approach. The riders moved along the valley's edge, searching the land. Thomas recognized their movements. They were looking for someone, or something. His heartbeat thudded in his ears. He stayed completely still. The riders paused at one point, scanning the area carefully. For a moment, Thomas thought they might turn toward the cabin. His muscles tensed, ready to act, though he didn't know what he would do. But after a long minute, the riders moved on, disappearing behind the ridge. Thomas let out a slow breath. Nalin also relaxed slightly, though her eyes remained watchful. They both understood now. They had no more time. Staying here was no longer safe. They needed to leave soon, even if Nalin was not fully healed. As the sun slowly sank behind the mountains, Nalin whispered something softly, something that felt like a promise or a request. Thomas didn't understand every word, but he understood the meaning. She was trusting him with her life, her safety, her hope of returning home. Thomas nodded, placing his hand gently over hers for a moment, assuring her she wasn't alone. The world outside might have been ready to tear them apart, but inside, this small cabin stood two people who had begun to rely on each other in ways neither had planned. Night fell, darker and thicker than the night before. The cabin felt smaller now, not because of fear, but because the outside world had shifted closer around them. Riders were searching. Trails were being watched. The desert was full of ears, listening for any sound. But inside the cabin, a quiet bond had formed, one born from danger, trust, and shared courage. And as Thomas kept watch through the night, he knew the next steps of their journey would be the most dangerous yet. But he also knew he would not turn back. Not while Nalin still needed him. The next morning came quietly. But both Thomas and Nalin felt the weight of the night before. The danger outside was no longer a distant thought. It was close, real, and moving around them. The riders they had seen proved that people were searching, and sooner or later, someone would come too close to the cabin. Thomas knew they had only one choice left. They had to leave. They had to start the long journey toward the mountains where Nalin's people might be traveling. Thomas stepped outside to check the sky and the land around them. The desert was cool in the early morning, the air fresh before the sun began to climb. But even in this peaceful moment, he felt a nervous pull in his stomach. Every shadow looked sharper. Every sound seemed louder. He listened for hooves or voices but heard nothing except wind moving through the rocks. That gave him a little comfort, but not enough to relax. He went back inside and gently woke Nalin. She opened her eyes slowly, as if every part of her body needed careful time to adjust. When she saw Thomas preparing the supplies, she understood without needing words. It was time. Thomas helped her sit up. She moved slowly, holding her side, but there was a determination in her eyes he had not seen before. She knew the risk of staying was too great. She knew that the longer they waited, the harder the journey would become. Thomas gave her a small drink of water and a piece of bread. She ate quietly, preparing herself. After a few minutes, she nodded, showing she was ready. He lifted her gently from the cot. Her legs trembled beneath her, but she stood, leaning slightly on him. Each step she took was careful, sometimes painful, but she did not complain. She simply breathed through the discomfort and continued. When they finally stepped outside, the bright desert light touched her face. She blinked against it, then looked around with a mixture of caution and relief. Seeing the open land gave her comfort. She had grown up with wide skies and endless horizons. She gestured toward the mountains in the far distance. That was the direction they needed to go. Thomas guided her to the horse. He helped her mount slowly, making sure she was balanced and secure. She held the saddle horn tightly, her breathing steady but strained. Thomas tied down the supplies and climbed up behind her, his arm lightly around her to keep her safe. They began to ride. The desert stretched before them like a giant map, empty but full of dangers. The horse walked gently at first, avoiding sudden movements so Nalin wouldn't feel more pain. Thomas kept his eyes on the land around them, scanning for movement or dust clouds that might signal riders. As they rode, Nalin pointed occasionally, showing small paths between the rocks or areas where the ground was safer. Her knowledge of the land became their guide, helping them avoid open areas where people might spot them. Thomas listened to her quietly, respecting every direction she gave. The sun rose higher, and the heat grew stronger. Thomas made sure to stop every hour, to let Nalin rest, and to give the horse water. When they paused near a large boulder, Nalin leaned back against him, exhausted. Her shoulders rose and fell with heavy breaths. Thomas steadied her gently. He asked her softly if she wanted to stop longer. But she shook her head. She wanted to keep going. Her people were somewhere ahead, and she feared falling behind. They continued the journey, moving from rock to rock, using the land like a shield. Nalin started explaining more about the mountains, speaking in simple English. She described certain rock shapes her people used as signs, small caves where travelers could rest, and dry riverbeds that led to safer trails. Thomas listened carefully, storing every detail in his mind. It amazed him how much she knew about the land, its paths, its hidden places, its secrets. At midday, they found shade beneath a tall cliff. Thomas helped Nalin down from the horse. She walked a little, stretching her stiff legs, but every step made her wince. Thomas knelt beside her and checked her wound again. It wasn't bleeding, but it was still tender and swollen. He cleaned it gently, and she watched him with a quiet trust that had grown stronger since the day he found her. When she rested against the cool rock wall, Thomas sat nearby. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like they understood each other, without needing many words. Nalin lifted her hand and traced a symbol in the sand. Then, she pointed at Thomas and repeated the symbol. He didn't understand the meaning. So she drew a small line, representing a person standing and a curved line protecting that person. She looked at him and spoke quietly. Good heart. Brave. Cryman. Thomas felt his face warm. He wasn't used to praise, especially from someone who had seen so much hardship. He looked down at the sand, then back at her. He said softly, anyone should help someone in need. But Nalin shook her head. She pointed to the trail behind them, then to her heart, then to him. Her message was clear: many people would not have helped her. But he did. After resting, they continued. The day grew hotter, and the land shimmered under the sun. Thomas could feel the tension in Nalin's body as she leaned forward, doing her best not to show her discomfort. He whispered to her once in a while, telling her they were getting closer, even though he wasn't sure exactly how far they had to go. By late afternoon, they reached a narrow path between two tall cliffs. Nalin recognized it immediately. She tapped Thomas's arm and pointed ahead with more energy than before. Her people had used this path for generations. It was a sign they were on the right trail. Thomas guided the horse carefully through the passage. The walls rose high on both sides, giving them shade and protection. But there was also a strange quietness here, as if every sound echoed. Nalin watched the tops of the cliffs closely. Thomas did too. He knew they were entering the heart of her people's land. When they reached the other side of the cliffs, the land opened into a wide valley. The air felt different here, lighter, quieter, almost holding its breath. Nalin raised her hand and pointed to a distant cluster of rocks, shaped like 3 tall pillars. She whispered something in her language. Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but hope. Thomas slowed the horse as they approached the valley. He could sense they were no longer alone. The land felt watched, though he saw no one at first. Then, from the shadows near the rocks, 3 figures appeared, Apache scouts. They stood tall and silent, their eyes following every movement Thomas and Nalin made. Thomas raised his hands slowly, showing he held no weapons. His heart pounded, but he stayed calm. Nalin straightened herself, ignoring her pain. She spoke first, calling out in her language. Her voice, though weak, carried strength. The scouts listened, their expressions shifting as they recognized her. Thomas knew everything depended on this moment. The scouts approached slowly. Their eyes moved from Nalin to Thomas, studying him with sharp attention. Thomas stayed still, letting Nalin speak. She explained what happened, how Thomas had found her, how he had helped her, protected her, and taken risks to return her safely. The scouts listened closely. Their faces softened slightly, though they still looked cautious. When Nalin finished, one of them spoke briefly. Thomas exhaled quietly. They had reached her people, but the story was far from over. The valley grew quiet as the scouts stepped closer. Thomas could feel the tension in the air, so thick that even the wind seemed to move slowly. Nalin kept her hand on the saddle horn, trying to stay upright despite her pain. She spoke again, her voice trembling, but full of meaning. The scouts listened without interrupting her, their eyes moving between her face and Thomas's calm posture. After a long moment, the oldest scout stepped forward. He spoke a few words to Nalin in their language, and she answered softly. Then, the scout turned his attention to Thomas. He did not smile, but he also did not show anger. He studied Thomas with a steady gaze, as if trying to see the truth in his eyes. Thomas remained still, keeping his hands in plain view. He knew this was not the time to speak boldly or defend himself. He let the truth of his actions speak for him. The scout finally nodded and motioned for Thomas to follow. Nalin let out a soft breath of relief, and Thomas understood they were being allowed deeper into the valley. Slowly, he guided the horse after the scouts, feeling both relieved and nervous. The walls of the valley rose high around them, forming a natural shield. The deeper they went, the more Thomas realized this place was hidden on purpose. It was not easy to find, and only people who truly belonged here could move through it without fear. After a while, Thomas saw movement ahead, shadows emerging, figures stepping from behind rocks and tall grass. More Apache people appeared, watching silently. Their expressions were firm, cautious, and curious. Whispers passed between them when they saw Nalin leaning on the horse, pale and tired but alive. They recognized her, and their surprise turned into concern. Two women rushed toward them, their steps quick and full of emotion. Nalin straightened, lifting her hand weakly, greeting them in her language. They hurried to her side, speaking softly, touching her arm with gentle care. Thomas stepped back slightly to give them space, watching quietly as Nalin's people surrounded her. It was clear she was deeply loved in her community. The women helped her down from the horse. When her feet touched the ground, she almost fell, but they caught her carefully. One of the scouts signaled Thomas to stay where he was. Thomas obeyed without hesitation. He knew he was still a stranger here, and entering further without permission would be disrespectful. Nalin turned her head, searching for him. When her eyes met his, she smiled faintly, a small, tired smile, filled with gratitude. She raised her hand in his direction, as if telling her people that he was the reason she had survived. Her gesture made every watching face turn toward Thomas again. A group of elders approached slowly. They moved with dignity, their faces lined with wisdom and years. One of them stepped forward, his eyes calm but serious. He spoke in his language, and one of the younger men translated for Thomas. He said that Nalin had told them everything, how he found her, how he cared for her, how he risked his own safety to bring her home. The elder looked at Thomas as if seeing far beyond the surface, searching for the deeper truth of his character. The elder continued speaking. The translator explained that the Apache valued courage, honor, and the protection of life. Nalin's return, alive and safe, was something they believed deserved respect. The elder thanked Thomas, not with loud words, but with quiet sincerity. Thomas felt a weight lift from his chest. He bowed his head slightly, showing respect. He didn't expect any reward or praise. In his mind, helping someone in need was simply the right thing to do. But hearing gratitude from the people she belonged to meant more than he could express. Nalin's family guided her toward a shelter made of woven branches and blankets. Thomas watched her walk with their help. Before she entered, she turned again, meeting his eyes one more time. She placed her hand over her heart, a gesture he had seen before. He returned the gesture quietly. After she disappeared inside, the elders invited Thomas to sit near a small fire pit. A few of the scouts remained nearby, watching him, not with hostility, but with caution. This was a place where trust was earned slowly. Thomas understood. The elders spoke to him through the translator, asking about the journey, about the cabin, and about how he had met Nalin. Thomas answered honestly, explaining every detail in simple, calm words. He told them he never meant to interfere in their ways, but he could not leave someone hurt in the desert. The elders listened patiently, giving small nods. One elder said something long and thoughtful. The translator explained that their people had seen many hard days recently, clashes, misunderstandings, fear on both sides. But Thomas's actions showed a different path, a reminder that kindness could cross even the widest divide. Thomas felt humbled. He wasn't trying to change anything. He simply followed his heart. But hearing the elders speak about peace and understanding made him realize how important this moment might be. As the sun began to set, the valley glowed with warm golden light. The scouts finally relaxed their positions. Children peeked from behind their mothers, curious about the stranger. Some of the men nodded politely at Thomas. He nodded back, feeling the atmosphere shift from tension to acceptance. After some time, Nalin's family invited Thomas to a simple meal. They offered him food and water. It was a quiet but meaningful gesture. Sharing a meal meant he was no longer just a stranger, they were acknowledging him as someone who had done something honorable. Thomas ate slowly, grateful for their kindness. He noticed Nalin's brother watching him closely, studying him the same way she had in the cabin. But his gaze softened after a while, as if he, too, had begun to understand Thomas's true nature. Later, the elder stood and placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. Through the translator, he said Thomas had shown great courage, not only in helping Nalin but in coming here with respect and without fear. He told Thomas he would be allowed to leave the valley safely at dawn, with their blessing. Thomas nodded, feeling a quiet sense of peace settle in his heart. He didn't want anything in return. Knowing Nalin was safe and surrounded by her people was enough. Before night wrapped the valley in deep shadows, Nalin asked for Thomas. With support, she walked out of her shelter. Her steps were slow but steadier than before. She approached him, her eyes soft and grateful. She spoke in her language first, then used simple English so he could understand. She told him he had saved her life, protected her when she was alone, and helped her return to her family. She said her people would remember what he did, that his kindness would not be forgotten. Thomas felt emotion tighten in his chest. He didn't know what to say at first. Finally, he told her that he was glad she was safe, and that he hoped her path forward would be filled with strength. Nalin reached out and touched his arm lightly, a gesture of deep respect. Then, she stepped back, as her family guided her to rest again. Thomas watched her go, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. He knew their paths were different and would soon separate, but he also knew he would carry the memory of this journey forever. That night, Thomas slept under the stars within the valley, protected by people who had once been strangers. The next morning, the elders escorted him out. At the valley's edge, Thomas turned back one last time. In the distance, he saw Nalin standing with support, watching him leave. She raised her hand in farewell. He raised his in return. Thomas rode back into the open desert with a calm heart. He knew he had done something meaningful, not just for her, but for a whole community. And though the world would never write his name in any book, Nalin's people remembered him as the man who saved one of their own when the world expected him to turn away. In their stories, he became a quiet symbol of courage, a reminder that a single act of kindness could change the path of history, even if only by a small but lasting step.